My life ended while I was gaming, only for me to regain consciousness in a completely unfamiliar realm. Reborn as a younger, blonde nobleman named Raymond, my situation seemed ideal until I looked at the reality of my estate. My late uncle had entirely drained our treasury and left the granaries completely bare before passing away. To make matters worse, a hostile neighboring lord named Richard is marching to execute me and seize my territory in just 3 days. My entire military force consists of 17 elderly men, including one who can barely grip his weapon due to severe arthritis. As I despaired in my quarters, a sudden chime echoed in my mind, activating a digital interface identical to the game mount and Blade 2. This mysterious system instantly granted me a starting balance of 1,000 coins and 10 professional troops. Racing to my balcony, I observed 10 heavily armored fighters assembled in flawless ranks within the courtyard below. They stood motionless as statues, carrying shields emblazoned with an eagle emblem, projecting an aura so intense that even a local stray dog was terrified to make a sound. My elderly butler, Ryan, who had faithfully served 3 generations of my lineage, dropped his handkerchief in absolute bewilderment at the sight. Simultaneously, the 10 warriors struck their chest plates in unison and pledged their absolute allegiance to me, instantly reviving my hopes of survival. Recognizing that Ryan required an immediate explanation for this sudden army, I quickly fabricated a cover story. I claimed my late uncle had covertly assembled and drilled this elite vanguard, leaving me command of them via a final secret letter. Though it was pure fiction, the explanation succeeded flawlessly, transforming the old butler's pity into profound admiration and tears of relief. After sending him to quarter the troops, I locked myself away in my room, finally letting my composed facade slip as cold sweat soaked my back. Taking a deep breath, I reopened the interface to inspect my available missions, which consisted of 2 distinct assignments. The primary objective demanded that I withstand Richard's upcoming invasion to safeguard my realm, though failure meant my permanent demise. The secondary objective required me to expand my total military strength to 40 active combatants within the 3-day window. Seeing that basic recruits cost 20 coins each, I calculated that purchasing 30 additional men would require 600 coins. This investment left me with 400 coins, which was plenty to cover everyone's wages for the next 10 weeks. The moment I finalized the transaction, the system triggered a first-time user bonus, automatically promoting all 30 newcomers by 1 tier. Instead of receiving untrained peasants holding clubs, I found 40 fully equipped heavy infantrymen filling my courtyard. I stepped outside to survey the impressive gathering of 40 soldiers clad in deep red armor, their shields locked into an impenetrable wall. Just then, Ryan walked out with a refreshment tray and instantly froze, letting the bread scatter across the stones without even realizing it. His jaw remained dropped in utter shock as he stared at the quadrupled force, looking as though he had encountered a ghost. Maintaining a calm exterior despite my internal panic, I paced down the steps with my hands behind my back to deliver the next part of my lie. I confidently claimed my uncle was a masterful strategist who had successfully masked his true military might for 2 decades. Delivering this absurd tale with a practiced, enigmatic expression, I watched as Ryan fell to his knees in tearful gratitude to the heavens. The second I retreated into my private study, I abandoned the theatrical act and desperately called upon the system for guidance. Sinking into my seat, I stared at my remaining 400 coins and realized 40 mouths were a lot to feed with a war looming. 40 men still felt inadequate against Richard's impending forces, especially if his vanguard included heavy cavalry or specialized units. Reviewing the progression mechanics, I noted that advancing a soldier required 100 experience points and 25 coins. Realizing that passivity would ensure my downfall, I knew I had to actively seek out conflict to secure funding and veteran status for my troops. I summoned my butler and inquired about the locations of wealthy yet careless outlaws operating nearby. He directed me toward Redwater Village, where a notorious 50 to 60-man syndicate known as the Red River Brotherhood operated under a one-eyed bandit named Buck. Resolving to reclaim my taxes and discipline my troops, I fastened my blade, pulled my weathered noble cloak from the wall, and prepared for deployment. Ignoring Ryan's frantic protests, I declared that hardship would sharpen our resolve, promising a proper celebratory feast only after our triumph. With 40 armored boots striking the ground in perfect cadence, my new regiment began its eastward march toward the targeted settlement. Abandoning his lukewarm tea, the bewildered butler muttered about our collective insanity, but hurried to catch up with the column anyway. The trek proved miserable as yesterday's downpour had transformed the local paths into deep, sticky quagmires that ruined my footwear. In contrast, the system-generated infantry navigated the treacherous mud with effortless precision, maintaining their flawless formation. Upon our arrival at the hamlet, the local populace immediately reacted with absolute terror, barricading their homes and hiding their children. To these impoverished villagers, the sudden appearance of a heavily armed aristocratic detachment could only signal impending ruin. Ryan attempted to reassure the residents by knocking on a nearby door, but an elderly voice from within refused to trust his words. The hidden speaker revealed that a previous passing knight had made similar peaceful promises right before slaughtering their primary draft animal. The tense atmosphere shattered completely when one of my infantrymen drew his blade simply to scrape away the mud clinging to his shield, sending the entire village into an absolute panic. Before the situation could be de-escalated, a young girl, roughly 16 with a soiled face and unkempt hair, dashed out from the mill brandishing a rusted pitchfork directly at my vanguard. Though her legs trembled violently, she stood her ground firmly, screaming at us to retreat and declaring she would block the entrance even at the cost of her life. Adopting a different strategy, I stepped forward and presented a single silver coin, wealth capable of sustaining a peasant household for months, offering to trade it for a simple bucket of water. The entire settlement froze in utter disbelief at the gesture, as aristocrats in this realm were completely unaccustomed to paying for resources. After biting the coin to verify its authenticity, the girl lowered her weapon and pointed toward the local well. With the transaction concluded, I inquired about the whereabouts of the outlaws, and she directed me eastward into the depths of Red Valley toward an old, desolate lumberyard. She added a grim warning that a previously dispatched regional militia had ventured into that valley and never returned. Straightening my collar, I commanded my troops to advance, catching her faint, bewildered whisper about the existence of paying nobility as we entered the tree line. We eventually arrived at the perimeter of the lumberyard following a grueling march through the treacherous mire. I was completely breathless and exhausted after traveling less than 5 kilometers, whereas my system-generated infantry showed absolutely no signs of fatigue. Observing the stronghold through the brush, I noted a primitive wooden palisade and a cluster of basic cabins that offered no real tactical challenge. While I could easily dismantle such a camp in a video game, I refused to waste my own energy on a direct assault and devised a more cunning plan instead. Clad in a fine silk shirt and carrying a gem-encrusted sidearm, I presented myself as a wealthy, stranded aristocrat devoid of any military escort to serve as bait. While Ryan took cover behind a tree, my 40 combatants completely concealed themselves within the tall grass surrounding the clearing. I stood conspicuously in the open, idly tracing patterns in the dirt with a branch to draw attention to myself. The ruse succeeded immediately when a lookout spotted me and rushed back to inform their commander, One-Eyed Buck. Within moments, a disorganized mob of 50 to 60 outlaws emerged from the wilderness, brandishing dull axes and sharpened stakes while shouting about plunder. Upon my signal, 40 heavy infantrymen rose instantly from their concealment, establishing a flawless, interlocking shield wall within 3 seconds. The defensive formation comprised 20 kneeling and 20 standing soldiers, leaving absolutely no openings for an attack. Stunned by the sudden wall of steel, Buck attempted to halt his advance, causing his charging subordinates to collide into a chaotic pile behind him. After allowing them a moment to process their panic, I issued a single, decisive command to attack. The engagement was brief, characterized by the mechanical and lethal precision of my troops, as they executed a steady rhythm of shield bashes, thrusts, and tactical resets. In less than 60 seconds, more than a dozen outlaws were cut down, prompting Buck to cast away his weapon, drop to his knees, and plead for his life. I queried the interface regarding the possibility of absorbing the survivors, but the system rejected them due to their abysmal discipline and poor attributes. Feeling zero remorse for individuals who actively starved local communities, I watched the system display a meager post-battle loot summary of just 180 coins. It was infuriating to realize that navigating the deep mire and executing a flawless ambush against 50 combatants yielded nothing more than some worthless leather and damaged tools. The solitary consolidation was that 3 of my frontline fighters had accumulated enough experience to qualify for an immediate promotion. The main cache within the camp proved equally disappointing, containing only a few scattered copper pieces at the bottom of a container. Just as I began to feel genuinely insulted by the haul, Lane investigated further and uncovered a concealed pouch containing 53 silver pieces and 3 gold crowns. I claimed the currency without a second thought, as the system's evaluation of the salvaged weaponry left me desperate for actual funds. I then directed the detachment to load the seized grain supplies onto the transport wagons and secure Buck's severed head as official proof of the contract. My butler questioned the utility of transporting the coarse grain, but I countered with a smile, explaining that our public return of the goods was a vital part of the strategy. By the time our column marched back into Redwater Village, the horizon had turned a deep crimson from the setting sun. The local populace had retreated behind locked doors once more, save for Lucia, who remained stationed by the mill alongside the promised bucket of water. As the synchronized heavy footfalls of 40 soldiers abruptly ceased before her, she nearly stumbled back in terror. Lane then cast Buck's severed head onto the ground, causing it to roll directly to the young woman's feet. Her piercing scream prompted shutters to fly open across the settlement, and villagers began cautiously emerging, falling to their knees as they recognized the dead bandit. I instructed the infantry to begin unloading the grain supplies from the carts, completely shocking the onlookers. In this harsh world, it was unprecedented for a victorious nobleman to return recovered resources directly to the peasantry rather than hoarding them. An elderly resident openly wept as he gathered a handful of the returned wheat with trembling hands. Approaching Lucia, I deposited a second silver piece next to her water vessel, one to fulfill our original bargain, and one to honor her exceptional bravery. I turned to depart without another word, but we had not traveled far before the sound of hurried footsteps and a breathless voice pierced the evening air. Lucia came running barefoot through the deep mire, holding up her garments with desperate, wide eyes, pleading to be taken along as a servant. She offered to handle laundry, prepare meals, and tend to the mounts, explaining that her grandmother had urged her to seize this unexpected lifeline. Halting the column, I turned to face the exhausted young woman, who remained resolutely steadfast despite her visible terror. Ryan immediately attempted to dissuade me, arguing that harboring an unwashed peasant girl would severely compromise my aristocratic standing. I countered his objection by stating that in a brutal world, resilience and bravery carried far greater value than aristocratic pride, before instructing the girl to board the transport. Bursting into tears of relief, she climbed onto the salvaged grain sacks without uttering another word as the column resumed its journey. Upon our return to the fortress, I placed her in the butler's care to be properly bathed, and immediately accessed the digital interface. 3 of my frontline infantrymen were fully eligible for advancement, requiring a total investment of 75 coins, which I instantly finalized. A gentle white radiance enveloped the 3 chosen warriors, dissolving to reveal heavily reinforced iron scale plating where their basic leather gear had been. Their physical builds were noticeably more robust, and they carried broader, significantly sharper armaments, proving the currency had been exceptionally well spent. Hearing approaching footsteps, I turned around and found myself barely able to recognize the young woman standing before me. Cleansed of all the wilderness grime and soot, Lucia possessed smooth, radiant golden hair cascading over her shoulders, clear porcelain skin, and bright, serene blue eyes. She was draped in an oversized tunic that had previously belonged to me, as the estate completely lacked feminine attire, making her appear almost ethereal under the flickering torchlight. I maintained a completely detached facial expression, though internally I felt immensely satisfied with the incredible return on my 2 silver coins. Ryan then approached me with an unexpected perspective, having witnessed the mystical transformation of the troops without experiencing a shred of fear. Instead, he hailed me as a divine chosen one, explaining that this realm harbored legendary figures blessed by deities who could cleave stone, don indestructible plate, and command elements like lightning. He concluded that the radiating white glow was a martial blessing, assuming I was a covert vanguard of the baronial bloodline who had intentionally masked his supernatural potential. I chose not to correct his elaborate theory, realizing this information was incredibly valuable because it confirmed the open existence of magic in this world. If local sorcerers could naturally manifest destructive spells and divine energy, my digital system parameters would blend in perfectly without generating suspicion. Allowing the enigmatic aura to linger, I dismissed the butler to rest, reminding both of them that a decisive confrontation with Baron Richard loomed on the horizon tomorrow. The elderly attendant offered an exceptionally low, reverent bow, while Lucia observed the display with a softening expression, realizing her choice to follow me was entirely correct. I awoke the following morning experiencing immense hunger, realizing I had not consumed a single authentic meal during my 2 entire days in this realm. Lucia soon arrived carrying my breakfast, which consisted of a chalice of water and a portion of rye bread so incredibly dense that it chipped the table layout without sustaining a single crack. She immediately dropped to her knees to apologize for the poor quality, but I told her to rise, noting that any food capable of silencing hunger was perfectly acceptable. Sudden, aggressive shouting from the lower courtyard interrupted us, signaling the premature arrival of Baron Richard's obese tax collector, Bobby. Mounted on horseback, the official was screaming profanities at Ryan, threatening to suspend our entire household from the metropolitan walls by dusk if we refused to capitulate. When he aggressively reared his mount, nearly striking the elderly butler in the face, I decided to take immediate action with the dense bread still gripped in my hand. Hurling the object directly from the second-story balcony, it struck Bobby squarely on the forehead, remaining entirely intact while splitting the collector's skin open. As the man bellowed and bled from the impact, I leaned casually over the balustrade, dryly commenting that his skull lacked the structural integrity of my morning meal. He instantly began shrieking declarations of open warfare, prompting me to deliver a single, whispered command into the corridor behind me to deploy our forces. Within seconds, 40 heavily armed infantrymen swarmed the courtyard, establishing an immaculate shield wall with their twin-headed eagle iconography catching the sunlight. Positioned at the vanguard were the 3 newly upgraded veterans, distinguished by heavy spears and gleaming iron scale armor that clearly separated them from ordinary foot soldiers. Bobby's complexion drained completely of color as he desperately attempted to retreat, but his mount was too paralyzed by the soldier's presence to take a step. Descending the grand staircase with deliberate slowness, I halted 5 meters from his position, intentionally keeping my hand away from my scabbard. The official broke into frantic tears, desperately claiming the entire hostile approach had merely been an unfortunate misunderstanding. Raising 2 fingers, I coldly informed him that we were not engaging in a conventional conflict but rather eradicating regional outlaws, and that I had absolutely no intention of negotiating. Dropping my hand, I uttered a final execution order, prompting 3 heavy spears to launch through the air and end the lives of Bobby and his attendants before they could collapse to the earth. Ryan stood completely frozen in absolute bewilderment as I pulled a spear from the carcass, cleansing the metal point against the collector's luxurious silk garments. I instructed the remaining staff to stable the captured mounts and securely pack the 3 severed heads into a wooden container lined with oil paper to prevent leakage. Bobby had arrived to deliver a hostile ultimatum, and I fully intended to return the favor by forwarding an unmistakable response directly to his master. The butler began rambling about traditional aristocratic warfare protocols, mentioning formal declarations, scented parchment, and elaborate, structured insults. I silenced his protests immediately, stating that delivering my terms in person was far more efficient and profoundly respectful to our opponent. Furthermore, I was highly motivated to claim Richard's wealthy treasury for my own expanding military expenses. Leaving a minimal garrison of 5 soldiers to secure our home fortress, I departed with a striking force of 35 heavy infantrymen. Lucia stood watching anxiously at the entrance gate as we prepared to march, and I instructed her to meet any uninvited guests with a wall of spears. Mounted upon the newly acquired black stallion, I attempted to project an aura of equestrian expertise, though my inner thighs began burning intensely within the first 5 minutes. While riding looked incredibly commanding from an external perspective, the actual physical experience was deeply uncomfortable. Our destination, Silver Pine Town, lay 15 kilometers away, and the staggering disparity between our territories filled me with bitter resentment during the journey. His domain featured pristine roads, flourishing agricultural fields, grazing livestock, and a formidable stone citadel protected by a deep moat. In contrast, my own ancestral home featured an entrance gate that could barely remain attached to its rusty iron hinges. As we approached the perimeter walls, the station sentries openly mocked us upon hearing Ryan announce our identity, fully assuming we had arrived to surrender with a shred of dignity. Believing they were about to witness our absolute submission, the heavy iron-reinforced gates were thrown wide open to let us enter the settlement. The station sentries gestured for our detachment to advance, observing us with the amused expressions of handlers watching fat sheep wander directly into a slaughter pen. A subtle smile touched my face, as this passive reception was precisely the tactical advantage I had hoped to exploit. I quietly remarked to Ryan that projecting an aura of complete harmlessness is the most reliable method for tricking an adversary into opening their own gates. Our entire column of 35 combatants proceeded calmly past the threshold, establishing a firm position entirely within the perimeter walls. Halting my mount, I reached into my saddlebag and retrieved the crimson wooden container containing our grim response. The captain of the gate watch approached with an expectant expression, clearly anticipating a tribute of luxury goods or precious metal. The moment I unlatched the lid, Bobby's severed head spilled onto the paving stones, instantly igniting a wave of piercing screams. The surrounding guards froze in absolute horror, staring down at the lifeless, upturned eyes of their regional tax collector. Instantly abandoning my pleasant demeanor, I barked a single, decisive command to clear out the entrance facility. My 3 elite shock troopers initiated the assault, launching their heavy spears with enough velocity to pin 3 sentries to the wooden fortifications before they could utter a sound. The remaining heavy infantry deployed rapidly across the courtyard, raising their shields and driving forward with leveled blades. The engagement dissolved into a completely one-sided rout, allowing me to remain comfortably mounted and observe the mechanical execution of my troops. I leisurely retrieved the piece of dense rye bread from my pocket and took a bite, watching the tactical liquidation of the gatehouse defense. The entire skirmish concluded in under 5 minutes, wrapping up before I had even finished consuming my meager breakfast. While the municipal guards were highly skilled at terrorizing local agrarian communities, they proved utterly useless against professional system combatants. My butler navigated his mount to my side, beaming with pride as he proclaimed the brief encounter a monumental and flawless triumph. I dryly instructed him to temper his flattery before his excessive praise caused me to lose my grounding entirely. Extending my blade toward the heart of the settlement, I declared it was time to confront our neighbor and inspect the contents of his estate cellar. Silver Pine Town proved to be an exceptionally prosperous hub, boasting brick architecture, an active smithy, a bakery, and stone-paved thoroughfares. The contrast between this thriving infrastructure and the dilapidated state of my own ancestral domain felt like looking at an entirely different world. However, the streets had completely emptied, with every viewport and entrance barricaded as hundreds of terrified residents observed our advance through structural fractures. I recognized that specific expression of absolute terror from countless digital strategy games, yet experiencing it on real human faces in the physical world felt fundamentally different. A sharp pang of discomfort tightened in my chest, prompting me to order my vanguard to reduce their pace and maintain absolute operational discipline. I emphasized that we were operating as a disciplined military force, not a band of marauding outlaws. Upon reaching a prominent intersection, our column encountered hundreds of local civilians kneeling submissively within the deep mire. Possessing no actual wealth to offer, an elderly resident held up a fractured wicker basket containing molded bread and 2 withered apples, pleading desperately for their lives. A terrified young girl clung tightly to his leg, completely unable to raise her eyes toward our heavily armed detachment. I stared at the pathetic offering, vividly remembering my former life filled with climate control, high-speed digital connectivity, and on-demand food delivery services. It was profoundly jarring to witness real people offering decomposing rations simply to bargain for their survival against my blades. Reaching into my personal coin pouch, I dropped a handful of currency directly into the old man's dilapidated basket. I formally declared that the weapon of the Balan lineage strictly targets tyrants and villains, promising that my troops would never harm an innocent civilian. I then commanded the gathered crowd to rise, return to the safety of their homes, and clear the thoroughfare, noting that I was on a strict schedule. The assembled populace broke into soft weeping, transitioning instantly from paralyzing terror to profound, overwhelming relief. Ryan immediately interpreted the gesture as a masterful diplomatic strategy designed to secure the absolute loyalty of the local populace. I chose not to correct his elaborate political theory, keeping the simple reality to myself. I merely refused to behave like a monstrous conqueror. As our column advanced, tightly closed shutters parted slightly, and the glances directed at my crimson mantle carried significantly less hostility and fear. I focused my attention on the stone keep positioned at the geometric center of the municipality, hoping Richard had prepared himself for our meeting. Up close, the central fortress proved far less intimidating, featuring a moat that was little more than a wide trench and structural masonry covered in thick moss. I had fully anticipated a desperate defensive stand characterized by descending boiling oil, archery barrages, and fanatical resistance. Instead, the primary gates stood completely unbarred, and the defending garrison was already kneeling in the dirt, having discarded their armaments. Our force entered the central enclosure without encountering a single shred of physical resistance. Within the courtyard, Baron Richard knelt quietly with his upper limbs securely bound behind his torso. He defied my expectations entirely, presenting himself not as a bloated, trembling coward but as a physically robust, poised commander who maintained an upright posture despite his captivity. His personal sidearm lay on the earth beside him with the hilt extended outward, executing the traditional aristocratic gesture of absolute capitulation. Before I could initiate the interrogation, he spoke up, inquiring if I was the newly arrived sovereign of Balan town. Glancing past my position to survey the ranks of heavy infantry, he openly commended my command capabilities and noted he felt no shame in falling to a chosen one. Hearing that specific title once more, I dismounted my stallion to fully capitalize on the tactical opportunity. Richard clearly possessed critical regional intelligence that I lacked, and an aristocratic captive who had lost everything is the most transparent source available. I demanded that he explicitly define what a chosen one actually signified within this realm. He explained that certain rare individuals are born with a divine imprint woven directly into the fabric of their souls. This latent potential triggers during moments of extreme duress, profound emotional trauma, or mortal peril, awakening extraordinary supernatural capabilities. He then detailed the 5 standard tiers of mortal progression accessible through rigorous discipline: spark, glimmer, candlelight, bright moon, and shining sun. Beyond these human limitations lay the mythical echelons of epic, myth, sanctuary, and demigod, categories preserved only within ancient lore. When I questioned him regarding my own current standing, he paused briefly before evaluating me at the fundamental spark tier due to my recent awakening. He characterized my specific manifestation as a warlord attribute, a rare gift enabling a commander to magically materialize and direct elite military forces. His expression then darkened significantly as he confessed that he had once come incredibly close to grasping that identical divine potential himself. Overhearing the captive's ancestral name, Ryan was completely unable to suppress a sharp, involuntary gasp of recognition. It became immediately apparent that Richard's background involved a far more significant geopolitical narrative than a simple border dispute. The butler instantly identified the Windsor lineage as a legendary aristocratic house that had anchored the northern defensive perimeter for 3 centuries. While I was entirely ignorant of this regional history, I maintained a perfectly stoic expression while Ryan quietly provided the vital context. At that point, Richard's stoic composure shattered completely, and he confessed that he was never intended to be a minor frontier baron. He revealed that he was actually the firstborn descendant of the elite Windsor dynasty, originally designated to inherit the entirety of their vast northern empire. Robust, highly intelligent, and extensively schooled in elite fencing and grand strategy from his earliest years, he seemed destined for greatness. Yet at the age of 15, during the sacred ritual where aristocratic youths traditionally manifest their divine potential, his soul remained entirely inert. No spark materialized, no supernatural energy surged, and his opportunistic stepmother instantly exploited this public failure to orchestrate his absolute ruin. She systematically stripped him of his inheritance, transferred his birthright to her biological son, and cast Richard out into this desolate, rain-slicked border territory like common refuse. Even his biological father acquiesced to the betrayal. A bitter reality Richard bellowed into the vacant courtyard with trembling fists and bloodshot eyes. The surrounding infantrymen observed his breakdown with solemn expressions, and even the hardened butler could not help but feel a profound wave of sympathy for the disgraced noble. Concluding his outburst, Richard pressed his forehead against the freezing masonry, offering a final, desperate plea for the safety of his spouse, his daughter, his retainers, and the municipal populace. He insisted that the entirety of the transgression rested solely upon his shoulders and begged that the innocent be spared from retribution. I maintained a silent composure while meticulously analyzing the geopolitical variables of the situation. While execution represented the most secure path to eliminating a future threat, the digital interface had already explicitly warned me that my administrative capabilities were severely lacking. Richard possessed exceptional administrative competence, a profound sense of duty, and a powerful, pre-installed drive to exact vengeance upon the lineage that had discarded him. Recognizing that such intense personal motivation could be steered into an incredibly potent asset, I decided to utilize his grievances for my own expansion. Breaking off a fragment of my dense, structural morning bread, I tossed it onto the paving stones directly before his knees. I calmly informed him of my general aversion to executing individuals, particularly those whose practical utility had not yet been thoroughly exhausted. Resting the flat of my blade heavily upon his shoulder, I presented a binding alternative. I offered to preserve his life and accept him as a sworn vassal, promising him a legitimate path to wage war against the dynasty that had humiliated him. However, I added an absolute stipulation. A single treasonous thought would result in the utter annihilation of everything and everyone he held dear. Acceptant of the terms, Richard pressed his lips to my footwear and swore a sacred oath upon the enduring legacy of his ancestors. The digital interface chimed instantly, signaling the successful completion of the campaign objective and advancing my profile to the second level. The rewards materialized immediately. A massive deposit of 3,000 coins, 50 tactical experience manuals, and a genuine martial sidearm possessing actual offensive properties to replace my previous ceremonial prop. Furthermore, the system unlocked advanced structural blueprints and granted access to significantly higher tiers of military recruitment. Rising to my full height, I faced the gathered municipal crowd and loudly proclaimed a 3-year total tax exemption, alongside double wages for any local combatant who pledged to remain in service. The central square erupted into a deafening roar of absolute jubilation from the residents. Ryan stood off to the side with tears streaming down his weathered face, quietly whispering to the memory of my late father as if the old lord were watching our triumph from the heavens. While I maintained a majestic, self-assured smile for the public, internally I was deeply grieving the massive loss of 3 full years of territorial tax revenue. I then followed my newly minted vassal into the interior of his central keep. The moment I crossed the threshold, I was enveloped by a wave of ambient warmth, thick woven carpeting, and a roaring hearthfire. It was immediately apparent that this man had been living in absolute luxury, while I had spent my nights on a deteriorating wooden frame covered in mildewed insulation. Even in official exile, Richard's daily standard of living had drastically eclipsed my own. Sudden, Hurried footsteps echoed from the upper landing as a young girl came racing down the staircase in tears toward her father. Following closely behind was his spouse, Eleanor, draped in a luxurious blue velvet gown, her eyes visibly swollen from weeping. The sight of my heavily armed vanguard caused her complexion to turn utterly pale. Rather than panicking or fleeing, she resolutely positioned her body between my troops and her offspring, shielding the young girl completely with her own frame. She tightly embraced her child and called out for us to seize the ancestral silverware and her personal dowry from the sellers, begging only that we refrain from harming Alice. I raised a hand, commanding my heavy infantrymen to take an immediate step back to de-escalate the tension. Richard moved calmly to comfort his family, drying his daughter's tears before escorting both of them forward to present them with proper aristocratic etiquette. The young girl executed a formal curtsy, offering a small, trembling greeting that resonated with me in an unexpected manner. In my former life within digital strategy games, settlements burned and populations vanished with a simple click to advance the text layout. Here, however, a living child stood breathing before me, and I realized that a more ruthless choice at the municipal gates would have ensured her demise. Removing my gauntlets, I formally reassured Eleanor that my blade was drawn exclusively to enforce regional stability, never to terrorize innocent civilians. Her posture visibly relaxed as the profound weight of terror finally lifted from her shoulders. Noticing that my butler was eyeing a heavy brass candlestick with an expression that strongly suggested an intent to pilfer it, I quickly intervened. I dispatched him to the old fortress to safely escort Lucia to our new headquarters, commanding that she be provided hot sustenance and explicitly exempted from bowing to any individual. Richard then invited me to join his household for a formal evening repast. The spread featured a beautifully roasted haunch of venison, fine cheeses, pristine white bread, and exceptional aged red wine extracted from his private vault. While standard fare for nobility, to someone who had survived on dense rye splinters and freezing mud for 48 hours, it felt like an absolute banquet. Over the course of the meal, Richard revealed the true catalyst behind his sudden capitulation, clarifying it was never driven by mortal terror. He explained that his decision crystallized the exact moment he witnessed me depositing currency into the elder's fractured wicker basket on the open street. He noted that the Windsor family maxim dictated a knight's weapon must always safeguard the defenseless rather than enforce tyranny, a principle he had nearly lost during his bitter years of isolation. My simple act of charity had forcefully reminded him of his original code. Rising from his seat, he struck his chest plate firmly with his fist, delivering a formal martial salute rooted entirely in genuine respect rather than mere political hierarchy. Setting down my dining utensils, I let my customary, theatrical smirk slip away completely. I raised my chalice, clinking it firmly against his own to toast his enduring dignity. For the first time since my bizarre transition into this world, a profound sense of genuine tranquility settled over me. This peace stemmed not merely from a satiated appetite, but from the concrete realization that I was no longer navigating this hostile landscape entirely isolated. As the wine began to take effect, I remembered that critical administrative tasks still required my immediate attention. Signaling for Richard to follow, I led the way out into the central courtyard of the keep. My 40 system combatants were distributed quietly around several campfires, meticulously maintaining their armor and sharpening their sidearms. There was an absolute absence of gambling, rowdy shouting, or typical mercenary intoxication. The absolute second I entered the enclosure, the entire force rose in unison to deliver a flawless military salute. Accessing the digital configuration panel, I finalized a massive troop advancement script. A balance of nearly 1,000 coins vanished from my profile instantly, triggering a massive explosion of brilliant golden radiance across the entire courtyard. Richard watched in paralyzed disbelief as 37 of my frontline fighters underwent a profound physical evolution right before his eyes. Within the span of 2 brief breaths, their worn leather gear transformed into interlocking plates of iron scale armor, their blades elongated and sharpened, and their physical frames expanded with dense, visible muscle mass. Pointing a violently trembling hand at the transformed ranks, He found himself scarcely able to articulate his shock. He stammered that even the High Archbishop of the Holy See lacked the divine authority to fundamentally restructure the physical anatomy and equipment of 30 combatants simultaneously. I calmly informed him that such an exhibition was merely standard procedure for my operations, asserting that my forces could continue to expand indefinitely as long as I willed it. While that statement was entirely accurate, the unspoken reality I kept entirely to myself was that my financial reserve was screaming in agony from the expenditure. Turning to Richard, I noted that establishing absolute control over this newly acquired territory demanded more than heavy infantry alone, necessitating the immediate integration of long-range support. I authorized a further transaction of 6,000 coins to summon 30 highly proficient Imperial archers, who emerged from the surrounding shadows like silent specters. Clad in iron-reinforced armor and wielding composite recurve bows, they possessed heavily calloused hands, steady respiration, and eyes that instinctively scanned the architecture for optimal firing positions. Richard's analytical faculties ceased to function entirely as he took in the supernatural deployment of the ranged specialists. I questioned him directly regarding what tactical objectives he could accomplish with a unified force of 70 such flawless combatants under his direct authority. Dropping to one knee, he confidently declared that he could dismantle an ordinary force of 300 soldiers in open warfare and defend the citadel against 1,000 bandits without sacrificing a single defender on the battlements. I formally transferred absolute operational command of the detachment to him, instructing him to manage their training, organize regional patrols, and implement whatever tactical formations he deemed optimal. I emphasized that my objective was to field a highly adaptive, functional army within 3 days rather than a collection of motionless statues. Pressing his forehead against the earth with a visibly trembling voice, he swore a solemn oath to wage war to the absolute death for my enduring glory. Internal guilt twinged within me, as the primary catalyst for delegating the entirety of the military administration to him was my overwhelming desire to get some sleep. Wishing him a pleasant evening, I retreated to the interior quarters and collapsed heavily onto Richard's exceptionally warm mattress. I drifted into a deep slumber before I could experience a single shred of embarrassment regarding my abrupt departure from the courtyard. I awoke perched upon a bed spacious enough to comfortably accommodate 5 grown individuals, watching the morning sunlight stream through the viewport as my bones popped during a deep stretch. A solitary evening of genuine luxury had already managed to erase the physical memory of the backstraining platform I had endured back in Bondtown. Richard knocked respectfully at the door to announce that the morning repast was prepared, adding a brief mention that he had implemented a few adjustments regarding my personal maidservant. I lacked any concrete understanding of what that implied for a rural village girl who had arrived at the fortress heavily coated in wilderness mire and soot. Stepping into the grand dining hall, I halted abruptly at the threshold. Lucia was stationed adjacent to the lengthy banqueting table draped in a pristine, structured gown, her golden hair meticulously brushed and secured with a deep blue velvet ribbon. She was anxiously twisting the delicate lace accentuating her hemline with downcast eyes, exposing the elegant length of her pale neck. Her appearance had transformed entirely, shedding any resemblance to the furious youth who had brandished a rusted pitchfork at my vanguard, looking far more like a displaced aristocratic princess. The absolute instant she caught me observing her, a vibrant crimson flush spread across her face all the way to her ears. Attempting to execute a formal noble curtsy according to Richard's rapid instructions, she inadvertently tripped over her own footwear and began tumbling toward the floor. I extended a hand, gripping her arm firmly to prevent her from colliding with the stone masonry. She recoiled immediately from my touch, entirely refusing to meet my gaze as she adjusted her posture. Richard clarified that Eleanor had personally selected the attire, noting that the presentation of a sovereign's personal retinue directly influences his political prestige. Acknowledging the sound tactical logic of his perspective, I quietly validated my initial decision to place my absolute trust in his administrative capabilities. I instructed Lucia to take a seat and join me for the meal, causing her to freeze instantly and glance toward Richard as if requiring formal permission to comply. The knight pulled out the heavy chair for her, encouraging her to proceed by explaining that this exercise constituted vital behavioral training in remaining composed at an aristocratic table. I dryly inquired if she preferred that I manually feed her the portions myself, prompting her to immediately seize a piece of bread and begin eating before I could even finish the sentence. Observing her aggressively stuff the baked goods into her mouth while desperately trying to maintain a poised, aristocratic facade filled me with genuine amusement. Slicing my own portion of bread, I began to eat while shifting the conversation strictly back to territorial administration. I questioned Richard regarding how the system combatants had performed during their nocturnal watch. Straightening his posture, he delivered his assessment with the cold precision of a veteran commander. He revealed that the archers had assembled silently in the pitch black within 10 breaths, reacting flawlessly to every ambient sound surrounding the fortress perimeter. He asserted that even his biological father's legendary Winter Iron Guard could not hope to rival their operational efficiency at this tier. I offered a slow nod while continuing to eat, internally recognizing that such performance was mandatory given the 6,000 coins vanished to secure them. However, that line of thought sparked a deeper analytical question regarding our future military progression. If Tier 3 system units were already demonstrating such staggering battlefield efficiency, what terrifying capabilities would Tier 4, 5, or 6 combatants manifest? Furthermore, would such advanced military assets possess the raw destructive power required to withstand the high-tier divine chosen ones governing this realm? An underlying sense of incongruity shadowed the thought, though I could not immediately isolate the source of my sudden unease during the meal. A distinct realization finally crystallized. Ryan was completely absent from the morning gathering. Richard informed me that the elderly attendant had departed at the break of dawn, journeying back to Bontown entirely on his own initiative. The butler had concluded that a reliable administrator was required to oversee our primary seat of power while we were occupied securing Silver Pine Town. It was remarkably astute strategic foresight from a man whose primary contribution thus far had been dropping his handkerchief in absolute bewilderment. Shifting focus, I questioned Richard regarding the current state of the municipal treasury. He fell completely silent, his complexion turning a deep shade of purple as embarrassment washed over him. He confessed that he had surrendered the entirety of the financial books and accounting records exclusively to Bobby for several years, placing absolute faith in the official's integrity. Bobby had systematically fabricated continuous narratives of localized droughts, financial deficits, and aggressive bandit raids, all of which Richard had accepted without a single shred of suspicion. The knight had even gone so far as to liquidate his own ancestral silverware to cover artificial operational expenses that Bobby insisted were mandatory. I stared at him in utter disbelief, amazed that an exceptionally honest and capable military commander had been thoroughly plundered by his own administrator for years without ever noticing. We immediately marched to inspect Bobby's private estate. Situated prominently upon a hill crest, the residence was a luxurious 2-story brick villa featuring a manicured rose garden and elaborately carved black walnut entrance doors. The architecture was noticeably more opulent and structurally superior to Richard's actual defensive fortress. The knight admitted he had never previously crossed the threshold, as Bobby had consistently manufactured complex excuses to deny him entry. I commanded my heavy infantrymen to forcefully breach the entrance. The interior display was staggering, featuring brilliant crystal chandeliers, imported Persian carpeting, and shelving densely packed with fine porcelain, carved jade, and polished silver vessels. Positioned prominently in a corner sat a solid silver statuette of a goddess, a legendary Windsor family heirloom that Richard had been led to believe was plundered by outlaws. He had actually dispatched his personal guard on 3 separate military expeditions to hunt down those entirely imaginary bandits. We initiated an exhaustive search of the premises, eventually uncovering a concealed subterranean vault beneath the master bedroom flooring. Within the hidden space sat 5 massive oak lockboxes containing over 2,000 gold crowns, tens of thousands of silver pieces, official land deeds, valuable jewelry, and a massive hoard of stolen resources. Richard picked up a single glittering piece of currency, suddenly remembering his wife dismissing their household staff to conserve funds and his own agonizing hesitation over purchasing a simple dress for their daughter. and nearly lost his sanity to absolute rage. While I maintained a perfectly detached, stoic expression on the outside, internally I was already throwing a massive celebration over our newfound wealth. I immediately petitioned the digital interface to convert the entire hoard into Korea dinars, only for the system to coldly reject the command, stating that local gold was an incompatible currency and the parameters were strictly non-negotiable. When I attempted to bargain for a discounted exchange rate, the interface bluntly instructed me to show proper respect to the system guidelines. I stood there frozen, my hand resting on a lockbox overflowing with precious metal that was completely useless for my primary method of summoning professional troops. Observing my sudden stillness, Richard completely misread my expression, concluding that I operated on such an elevated spiritual plane that I found the plundered currency utterly repulsive. He respectfully proposed distributing the entire fortune back to the local populace, but I immediately vetoed the idea. Thinking rapidly, I recognized that while the digital interface refused the currency, local gold still possessed immense purchasing power within the physical realm. It could easily be deployed to conscript conventional forces, agrarian levies, traveling mercenaries, and retired veterans to serve as auxiliary manpower for territorial patrols, static defense, and frontline fortification. Handing 2,000 gold crowns over to Richard, I instructed him to enlist every able-bodied individual he could track down across the region. I commanded him to accept agrarian laborers with pitchforks, wandering knights, or anyone capable of holding a line, dryly noting that even a canine in iron plating would be welcomed on our battlements. Dropping to his knees with tears of gratitude welling in his eyes once more, the knight swore a solemn oath to forge an absolute army of steel for my domain. I told him to cease his constant kneeling and immediately get to work implementing the recruitment drive. As I departed the vault, I cast one final look back at the room overflowing with gold, quietly mourning the system limitations. Then a far more pleasant realization struck me. While local gold could not interface with my digital menu, it could easily purchase several hundred luxurious custom gowns for Lucia. Satisfied with that conclusion, I bellowed back into the room, commanding the infantry to transport every single coin back to the central keep without losing a solitary copper piece. I later observed the proceedings from the upper balcony while Richard efficiently managed the public enlistment process in the courtyard below. He constructed a rudimentary wooden table in the geometric center of the market square and dumped hundreds of gold coins across the surface in one highly theatrical cascade. The chaotic, roaring marketplace instantly fell into an absolute, breathless silence at the sight of the glittering wealth. The commander loudly announced the terms of service. Anyone who successfully passed the physical selection and signed the enlistment parchment would receive 5 silver pieces up front, alongside a daily ration featuring real meat. The gathered crowd completely lost its collective mind, shoving, screaming, and elbowing one another in a desperate frenzy to reach the front of the line. A disabled elderly farmer could be seen aggressively dragging his young nephew through the press of bodies to reach the table. 2 heavily armed mercenaries who had previously been observing the display with detached, crossed arms suddenly perked up and violently forced their way through the mob. Even the latecomers who arrived after the roster had filled fell to their knees, begging desperately for menial positions cleaning the stables just to attach themselves to the estate. By the time the registration concluded, the recruitment parchment was entirely obscured by hundreds of crimson ink fingerprints. 500 new recruits had officially pledged their lives to my banner in less than 2 hours. The local merchant guild materialized almost immediately afterward, suddenly projecting immense friendliness and offering elaborate apologies for their sudden inventory shortages the previous day. A particularly rotund merchant named Taboo arrived directly at the fortress gates escorting transport wagons laden with raw iron and forged spearheads, smiling warmly as if we were lifelong companions. Richard summarily purchased the entire shipment of military hardware and coldly instructed the merchant to vacate the premises. By nightfall, 500 newly minted auxiliary troops stood awkwardly assembled across the main drilling field. Their gear was a chaotic mess, with some standing entirely barefoot, others draped in deteriorating leather, and many wearing nothing more than a coarse textile shirt. While they strongly resembled a gathering of impoverished beggars, their expressions radiated an absolute, glowing enthusiasm. Lucia and a contingent of household maids moved through the ranks, distributing massive portions of rich meat stew and dense honey bread to the men. Deprived of any formal dining utensils, the recruits consumed the rations entirely with their bare hands, gorging themselves with such frantic speed that several individuals began choking. Richard ascended to the balcony to deliver his official report, his armor heavily coated in dust and his face showing profound physical exhaustion. He confirmed the successful enlistment of 500 men, noting that roughly 100 possessed legitimate prior combat experience. The remainder were simple agrarian laborers, yet their organizational morale had reached unprecedented heights due to the immediate distribution of coin and quality sustenance. The commander estimated that a single week of rigorous, uninterrupted drilling would render them fully operational for frontline combat. Sipping my tart local wine, I looked down at the 500 individuals meticulously licking their wooden bowls completely clean. Securing a full stomach was an excellent initial step, but I internally noted that their grueling physical trial would initiate the following morning. I silently hoped their digestive systems would not violently reject the sudden influx of rich meat before our weekly training window concluded. The subsequent 48 hours transformed into an absolute living hell for the newly conscripted auxiliary force. Richard systematically rumbled the entire garrison awake long before the first signs of sunrise, driving them to absolute physical collapse on the field. He continuously navigated his mount through the thick clouds of kicked-up dust, bellowing fierce threats and strict corrections at the faltering ranks. Yet the solitary variable that kept every single recruit moving forward through the exhaustion was the absolute guarantee of rich meat stew awaiting them at dusk. Not a single individual attempted to desert the camp, as the unprecedented quality of the daily rations was simply too valuable to risk forfeiting. I observed the intense training modules from the comfort of my balcony, lounging in a cushioned chair while enjoying chilled grapes. I had originally intended to personally descend to the field to lead the formations, given that my digital parameters grant passive efficiency bonuses when I am physically proximate to the troops. Then I remembered the delicate nature of my hands and my absolute lack of tolerance for choking dust and sweltering, sweaty throngs of bodies. Opting for comfort, I remained firmly anchored in my chair, offering a casual wave with a bare grape stem when Richard looked up to salute and thank me for my administrative supervision. In reality, I was merely killing time while awaiting the arrival of the local master tailor. Old Johnson soon arrived escorting a beautifully lacquered wooden container, with Lucia trailing closely behind him out of pure, unbridled curiosity. The artisan had nearly rejected the unorthodox manufacturing commission when he first reviewed the technical design parameters. However, the moment he observed the massive deposit of 10 gold coins, he instantly reversed his opinion and declared the blueprint an absolute masterpiece of high art. Unlatching the container, he revealed a meticulously crafted black and white maid ensemble featuring a distinct short skirt, intricate lace detailing, and a matching ornamental headpiece. It represented my solitary piece of spiritual comfort transported directly from the modern world into this bleak medieval landscape, executed to absolute perfection. Lucia leaned forward with an excited expression to inspect the contents, only for her face to instantly turn the vibrant shade of a ripe tomato as she unfolded the fabric. Rebounding backward in absolute shock, she began stammering incoherently, questioning if I had committed a massive logistical error and asking if this was attire reserved for a specific class of disreputable women. Adopting my most solemn, profoundly disappointed facial expression, I firmly corrected her assumption. I loftily explained that the garment represented the traditional ancient martyr's dress, a sacred, highly revered uniform originating from an old holy empire that had been tragically lost to the annals of history. I seriously detailed that the elevated, short hemline was intentionally engineered to constantly remind the wearer to remain profoundly humble and completely sever all attachments to personal vanity. I coldly asserted that only the purest, most exceptionally strong-willed maidens could don the sacred uniform without experiencing a shred of primitive shame. Concluding my lecture, I informed her that her sudden burst of embarrassment merely proved her spiritual fortitude remained woefully incomplete. Lucia stood motionless with tears glistening upon her eyelashes, genuinely re-evaluating the state of her own soul. Clenching her jaw with a look of profound gravity, she formally announced she would don the attire to safeguard her family's honor and cleanse her spirit. Seizing the garment, she marched behind the privacy screen with the grim determination of an individual executing a monumental spiritual trial. I immediately hoisted a leather-bound volume to obscure my face, grinning so intensely that my entire frame trembled from the effort of maintaining silence. The young woman was dangerously, almost effortlessly susceptible to my fabricated historical narratives. Lucia eventually emerged from behind the partition draped in the maid ensemble, her face completely crimson as she clutched the abbreviated hemline, utterly unable to raise her eyes. Preserving my most stern, uncompromising facial expression, I loftily informed her that absolute internal confidence was the solitary attribute she still lacked. Straightening her spine in response, she muttered a quiet mantra regarding her ancestral legacy and gradually began to adjust to the uniform. Sudden, violent hoofbeats interrupted the moment as a detachment of mounts crashed forcefully through our primary fortification gates. A knight clad in brilliant silver plate emblazoned with an ice wolf insignia pushed aggressively past my guards without bothering to dismount. 12 heavily armed cavalrymen positioned themselves in a rigid column directly behind him as he boisterously demanded Richard's immediate appearance. Covered in dust and sweat from the drilling field, Richard navigated his mount over to confront his malicious stepmother's royal emissary. The silver-clad knight retrieved an official parchment and tossed it contemptuously into a muddy puddle directly at Richard's feet without even deigning to look at him. The commander stood entirely paralyzed, realizing that retrieving the document meant sacrificing his remaining aristocratic dignity, while refusing meant open defiance of the powerful Windsor dynasty. As his knees began slowly dipping toward the mire to retrieve the letter, I projected my voice clearly from the upper balcony before his hand could touch the mud. I loudly informed the emissary that the Windsor lineage apparently specialized in producing absolute garbage alongside their legendary arrogance. I then commanded the knight to personally dismount, retrieve the document from the puddle, cleanse it thoroughly, and deliver it with proper aristocratic etiquette. The emissary instantly began bellowing an aggressive retort, but his voice cut short as 30 Imperial archers materialized across the high watchtowers. Simultaneously, 20 heavy infantrymen raised their interlocking shields at the gatehouse, training every single arrow directly at the knight's exposed throat. I calmly counted to 2, watching the color drain from the messenger's face as he evaluated the tactical reality. Dismounting his stallion, he scooped up the parchment, cleansed the mire away using his exceptionally expensive velvet mantle, and held it above his head with trembling hands. Richard accepted the document, but his face turned entirely pale as his eyes scanned the text. It was a formal invitation from his stepmother demanding our presence at a grand banquet within Winter City, the Windsor family's primary stronghold which housed over 3,000 professional troops. She explicitly desired an audience with the sovereign who had chosen to harbor her family's discarded offspring, making the correspondence a transparent and deadly trap. Gripping my arm in a panic, Richard vehemently insisted that I refuse the summons, declaring he would sooner lead his men into exile within the mountains than drag my household into his ancestral blood feud. I observed his frantic concern, internally validating what an exceptionally honorable and loyal companion he truly was, though he worried far too much. Taking the crumpled parchment from his grip, I carefully smoothed out the creases. I calmly reminded him that our destinies had become irrevocably intertwined the exact moment he swore allegiance to my banner. I emphasized that retreating and hiding merely meant waiting passively for an adversary's blade to find our necks, asserting it was far superior to march directly to the source and extend our own weapon first. Patting his armored shoulder, I instructed him to prepare his traveling gear, declaring we were journeying to Winter City to witness exactly what his wicked stepmother was capable of orchestrating. The absolute second Richard exited the chamber, my composed facade collapsed and I dropped into my chair like an empty textile sack. The entire display of unwavering confidence and tactical foresight had been pure theater. I possessed absolutely no viable plan. Winter City maintained a permanent garrison of 3,000 professional soldiers, whereas my entire military asset comprised 70 elite system units and 500 untrained agrarian laborers. I immediately summoned the digital interface, noting my remaining financial reserve stood at precisely 1,580 coins. The Level 2 upgrade had unlocked a unique structure, an interdimensional tavern capable of attracting and recruiting powerful wandering heroes. Without a second thought, I authorized the immediate expenditure of 1,000 coins to materialize the building, experiencing a sharp pang of financial agony as the wealth vanished. I stepped across the threshold of the newly constructed tavern, finding the interior densely packed with battle-hardened mercenaries engaging in raucous drinking and physical altercations. Scanning the room, I noted that Level 5 elite champions populated almost every table, yet each individual carried a steep recruitment fee of 800 coins. Possessing a meager balance of only 580 coins, I quietly turned my gaze away before any of the mercenaries could discern my financial inadequacy. My eyes eventually drifted toward a completely obscured, unlit corner of the establishment that even the most intoxicated patrons intentionally avoided. A distinct, freezing draft radiated from the shadows, where a remarkably tall, blonde warrior woman clad in heavy silver armor sat entirely isolated, meticulously polishing an enormous war hammer.